Alright, so this video is just showing you how to graph certain functions in your graphing calculator. So especially in Chapter 2, we're going to be using our graphing calculators a lot and graphing some functions beyond just like a typical straight line. So I just wanted to make sure you guys knew how to graph all these weirdo functions. And of course there are more out there that we're not going to have time to cover, but this should hopefully just give you a little introduction. So first of all, to graph something like y equals x squared, I've got my graphing calculator. I've obviously turned it on. You can see the cursor. And then you're going to click the y equals button anytime you want to graph a function. So y equals. And if there's, stuff in here, like if we had a whatever, just go through and clear out these lines. So hit clear to clear anything out. All right, so if I want to graph y equals x squared, this is going to be the graph of a parabola, so it's going to look like that. If I want to graph y equals x squared, I click the y equals button, I click my variable x right there, and then I can either click this shortcut button, this x squared button, or I'm going to go back and delete that, use the arrow and delete, or I could also use the caret key, and that's my exponent key. So y equals x squared. So either way, when I hit graph, there's my nice pretty parabola. And remember that you can use, so we're using the y equals button, we can use the trace button. We can use the trace button, which is right here, to identify points on the graph if we want. So we'll type in an x, and then our calculator will spit out the corresponding y. So if I type in x equals 3, for example, I know that 3 squared is 9, so I should have the ordered pair 3, 9, and I do. So graphing calculator jumps up there and I can see the 3, 9 ordered pair. And I could also type, for example, -3 using this negative key, -3. And that also gives me y equals 9 because -3 in parentheses squared is +9. Okay, so that's y equals x squared. Suppose that we wanted to graph y equals x cubed. So I'm going to go back into y equals. Hit that button. I'm going to clear this out. And I'm going to hit x and then caret, so raised to the power 3. And right now my calculator is in kind of like an old-fashioned mode, so it's showing the caret as I type it. Some of you guys have a newer calculator, and so you're just going to see it pop up in a superscript exponent, and that's great too. So x raised to the power 3, we'll graph that. And it kind of looks like a snake wiggling up through the origin there. So again, you can use your trace key and type in x values to get out the y values, or also remember you can use your table key as well. So your table key, if you see above graph, it says table, so I'm going to hit second and then graph to access the table. And I can just scroll around. So this is giving me a table of x and y values. So if x is -3, y would be -27, -3 cubed is -27, -2 cubed is -8, -1 cubed is -1, there's 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 8, 3, 27, and so forth. So you can use your table or trace function to identify points. I'm going to press second and then load to quit to go back to that main home screen. And also I'm just going to jump in, well actually, no, I'll leave this for now. So next, let's go ahead and graph this y equals square root of x function. So y equals, I'm going to clear that out. I want to graph the square root of x, and you can see my square root key is up above this x squared key. So again, I'm going to use my second key, and then I'm going to hit x squared, so the square root symbol pops up. So again, I'm in this old-fashioned mode, so I'm going to type x in parentheses, and then close it. So that's square root of x. These are your parentheses keys to close the parentheses. I'll hit graph. Okay, so that's what our square root function looks like. And suppose that instead I wanted to graph maybe the square root of x -3, let's say. So I could go into y equals, I'm going to clear this out again. So second square root x. Now see how the -3 is outside of the square root? So I'm going to close my parentheses and then type the -3. So that tells my calculator the -3 is outside of the square root, the x is under the square root. can go ahead and graph that. And I can see that my graph just shifted down 3 units because of that -3. If I go into, I'm just going to switch my mode real fast, so I'm going to go into the fancy new mode. I can do that on my calculator. Alright, so now my calculator is going to do fancy new mode. So now if I hit y equals square root of x, now I have the square root key. Here's my x. And you can see that little cursor that's kind of blinking to the right. If I want -3 to be outside of my square root, I'm going to use the right arrow and then put -3. Okay, so that's if you have that fancy new mode on your calculator, which many of you guys will if you just bought yours brand new. And just for comparison, let's also graph y equals the square root of x minus 3. So x minus 3, the whole thing under the square root. So I go into y equals, let's clear this out, second square root. Now I would do x minus 3, and I want the whole thing to stay under that square root symbol. So now I can see my graph shifting 3 units to the right from where that original square root function did. And if I'm in that older mode, so let me go to mode and switch back to classic, just for those of you guys who have an older graphing calculator. If I wanted to graph this function, square root of x minus 3, the whole thing under the radical sign, I would graph y equals second square root x minus 3, and then I would close my parentheses. And that means that the entire x minus 3 is under that radical sign. And there you go. And I just also want to mention one more thing before we see our next few examples. And there are some examples where they want you to graph maybe multiple equations on the same axes. So let's say we wanted to graph y equals square root of x, and then compare that to y equals the square root of x minus 3. So we can graph multiple equations at one time. That's why we have all of these y equals. So we could graph y equals the square root of x, and then use the down arrow to get down to the next y equals. And now we could graph square root of x minus 3, close the parentheses. And our calculator is going to show us 2 different graphs so we can compare. If we use the trace button, right now we're on the blue square root function. So anytime I type, 4, I'm going to get positive 2. The square root of 4 is positive 2. If I want to toggle back and forth, let's see, I can hit the up or down arrows. So you can see on my screen it's going from blue to red. So now when I hit the down arrow, I'm on the red function, the square root of x minus 3 function. So if I type, for example, x equals 0, I get nothing for y because that's not in our domain. If I type x equals 3, then I get my y equals 0. And then x equals 7 gives me y equals 2, and so on. And also if you go into the table, second and graph to access the table. So again, you see your list of values. This is my square root of x function. This is my square root of x minus 3 function. And you can see they have different domains. Wherever there's an error, that means these x values are not in the domain. So the square root of -1 would be an imaginary number, right? So it's not in our square root of x domain, the domain of our square root of x function. But starting with x equals 0, we've got y equals 0, there's 1, 1, there's 4, 2. And then over here for our square root of x minus 3 function, we've got the ordered pair 3, 0, 4, 1, 7, 2, etc. So you can see that in the table as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to my fancy new mode. Back to math print. Alright, so going into y equals, let me just clear these out. Clear. Alright, so now I want to go ahead and graph my cube root of x function. So a lot of weirdo functions can be found in the math menu. So if I click the math key, right here under my first menu, the math menu, there's a shortcut for cubing a function, by the way, or cubing a number. But down for number 4, it says the cube root. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And then I can type what I want in there. In this case, the cube root of x. Graph that function, and that's what I get. So there's my cube root of x function. You can find that under the math menu. And also, this is y equals absolute value of x. We can also find that under the math menu. So I click y equals, I click math. I don't see my absolute value here, but if I scoot to the right under the number menu, the very first thing I see is ABS, and that stands for absolute value. So when I hit that, for my fancy new calculator, the absolute value bars come up, and I can do the absolute value of x. Gives me this sharp corner. It's always a V-shaped function, these absolute value functions. And if I were in my older modes, let me go to mode, back to classic, go back into y equals. If I go to math, scroll over to number, and choose option 1, absolute value, now it says ABS. I type my x, and then I close my parentheses around that. And that's still your absolute value function. And again, just to show you a different version, if we had y equals absolute value of x plus 5 with the entire thing inside the absolute value sign, click math, go to number, absolute value, x plus 5, close parentheses around the whole entire thing to denote that it's inside the absolute value signs. And we see our graph is shifted 5 units to the left from what we initially had. Then if we wanted to do that with our newer calculator, so if you have a newer calculator, you're going to go to math, absolute value, and then just make sure the x plus 5 stays inside your absolute value sign. Alright, and if you wanted to graph like absolute value of x plus 5 minus 2 or something like that, math, number, absolute value, x plus 5, use the right arrow to get out of there, or close your parentheses if you're in the older calculator view, and then put minus 2.